I have gotten involved in a lot of citizenship theory, and I keep thinking about this idea of recognition and belonging and all of that good stuff. And some of the possible solutions that I've been finding actually come from the Indigenous rights movement, which was not where I was expecting it to come from, but there's some kind of cool connections happening there. And so in about, I guess it was 2009, if I'm getting that right, I found myself in very, very cold territory, which was ironic because I hate winter. I found myself up in the Arctic Circle in Canada. And the reason for that is that the territory of Nunavut, which is about a fifth of the landmass of Canada, it's the red to your left, that is now land that is set aside for governance by the Inuit people, or the Eskimos. And the reason that this happened is because a lot of Inuit social movement leaders got together and pushed the government for decades until finally they negotiated the largest land claims agreement in history. And so now the Canadian government has basically acknowledged that the Inuit were illegally colonized, that they had their human rights stripped from them, their human dignity stripped, and they do indeed have certain rights to the land and the wildlife and the resources that mainstream, largely white Canadians do not have. And so now we have this really interesting experiment, because Nunavut's only been around since 1999, and we're still kind of waiting to see how it's all going to pan out. And so to give you a sense, there's a lot of these really small communities that are mostly connected by gravel landing strips, these itty-bitty little airports. But the capital is called Iqaluit. You might not be able to see from where you're sitting, but it's just below the Arctic Circle, and most of the villages are actually north of the Arctic Circle. So if you go to Montreal and just keep going north, you'll hit Nunavut. So I think it's important to understand how human rights were violated in Nunavut before you can really fully comprehend how it ever came to be that a sovereign country like Canada would give up 1/5 of its landmass. I mean, that's huge. And a big part of it had to do with culture. I think that most of us in this room have a pretty good understanding of what genocide means, right? It's a mass killing with the intention of wiping out an identity group. So wiping out a religious group or a racial group. We talk about that a lot in human rights, but what we don't talk about so much is the idea of cultural genocide, right? The idea not of killing people, but of killing traditions and making people no longer one identity group, but turning them into something else. And that's what we saw happening certainly in the United States, certainly in Canada, and definitely up in the Canadian Arctic. And so the plan had been to make people into Canadians, right? You don't need to be Inuit anymore, you're gonna be Canadian now. And so there are a few different ways that happened, and most of it had to do with traditions. So one, residential schools, maybe you've heard about this, it happened in the United States too, where kids were basically scooped up and put in boarding schools. They weren't allowed to speak their native language, they had to, convert to Christianity, they had to speak English, they had to become little white Americans or little white Canadians, and this was incredibly, incredibly destructive for their culture, obviously. So you have generations, they call them the lost generations, that can't speak their native language and really have no understanding of things that were once very basic, like how to survive off the land. Obviously, being in the Arctic, you have to have some serious camping skills, right? Another thing that happened, though, were the sled dog massacres. And this is controversial because the Canadian government still hasn't acknowledged that this happened, but it happened. From, we think, probably the 50s through maybe as late as the early 1980s, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the Mounties, would go into these kind of remote settlements, and the dogs are all kind of lined up outside. They're warm, they're happy, they're in their pack, and the Mounties would go up and just one by one shoot all the dogs in the head. And it wasn't that they didn't like dogs. Who doesn't like dogs? It was because the Inuit relied on these dogs to hunt and to travel and to survive. So all those waterways that you saw on the map a few minutes ago, those are all frozen about 10 months a year. That's the interstate system, right? That's how you get around. That's how you go to different villages. That's how you make your living. And so if people couldn't do that anymore, if all those dogs were gone, well, everybody's going to have to move into towns, right? They're going to have to live in houses. They're going to have to buy their groceries at the grocery store. And, you know, one of the great things for a government is it's a lot easier to control a population if you have them all in one spot, right? And so the idea was, you know, we're going to get these people, we're going to make them into Canadians. They're going to be part of the money market economy and all of that. One of the problems with that is that there's really no economy up there, right? So now we have all these people living in towns who can't find jobs. And so we have, I'll show you the next slide, we have people who used to live off the land in igloos in the winter and in animal hide tents in the summer that are now living in these government subsidized houses in places like Iqaluit. And I mean, we're talking 20 people crammed in a 3-bedroom apartment. Seriously crammed conditions. Nunavut has the highest suicide rate in North America. We have huge, horrible rates of domestic violence, drug abuse, alcoholism, you name it, right? Because again, talking about human dignity, you need a sense of purpose, right? And so you take a group of people who are incredibly proud, incredibly self-sufficient, really strong community values, and you take all of that self-sufficiency away and you put them in basically a welfare situation where they're dependent on the government to stay alive. You strip them of human dignity and their culture is gone, right? You have a hunting culture that doesn't hunt anymore. And so this has been really, really problematic. And it's even problematic at a basic level in terms of nutrition. This was really shocking to me when I was there. So if you're hunting, you live off what they call country foods, right? Caribou, seal, polar bear, Arctic char, which is like salmon, very, very good. All kinds of things like that. And this is permafrost. You can't ever farm. There's no fruit, there's no vegetables unless you fly it in. So you'd think, okay, that's not very healthy. That's like the Atkins diet times 1,000. But actually, in reality, what we found out was that the ecosystem found a way to make it work. So if you look at a little piece of seal meat, it has more vitamin C in it than an entire bag of Florida navel oranges. So people actually had really balanced diets. They were doing pretty well for themselves. But now, most people aren't able to hunt anymore. They're living in towns, and they go to the grocery store. It's actually called Arctic Mart. That's what it's called. Which I don't know. For some reason, I found that hilarious. And I went around one day with my camera taking pictures. And so keep in mind, the food either has to come in on a supply ship that comes in one time a year when there's finally enough open water to get in. So one ship a year, or it has to be flown in. So if things are heavy or they're perishable, they're going to be really expensive. So when I was there, the US dollar and the Canadian dollar were just about the same. So for a little plastic tub of cranberry juice, it was about 25 bucks. Really expensive. So you have now all these people, you know, basically, no offense students, but eating what you're eating, right? Ramen noodles and Nesquik and all that. It's not good for you. Don't eat McDonald's so much. And so this has become really, really problematic. And so what we're talking about, not just human dignity and all of these cultural identity rights, but we're also talking about really, really practical things like basic nutrition, right? All of these things are now messed up, basically, because that natural balance, that order of things has been disturbed. So if we look at Nunavut today, you know, it still has a lot of these problems. It's definitely not perfect. Things haven't been solved because Nunavut exists. But I point to it as a positive case study because I think the very fact that Canada has owned up to the fact it made a mistake is really, really powerful, right? Unfortunately, the American government has not owned up to our Indigenous peoples in the same way that the Canadian government has, but, you know, fingers crossed that's going to happen. And kind of one of the common themes of the Indigenous rights movements is this call for self-determination. The idea that, you know, cultures change, right? American culture today, as we're sitting here, you know, secretly texting, is not the same as American culture 100 years ago. It's going to change. All cultures do. So the idea isn't, how can we make the Inuit stay frozen in time so they can live in their igloos for all of eternity? That's not the point, right? But the point rather is for people to be able to say, these are the cultural norms or the cultural traditions that I find useful that I want to keep for myself. And then there are these other things that I want to adopt. right? So it's great that people can go hunting and do these things if it's important, but maybe there are some, Inuit kids that really want to go to medical school in Montreal and be heart surgeons, right? That's okay too. So the idea is that the people get to decide their destiny, not the Canadian government. And I think that's really, really key when we go back to this idea of recognition, right? It's recognizing that people are intelligent enough to be able to make these choices for themselves. You don't want to get to the situation where the government's telling you, what's best for your culture, what's best for your society. The government is supposed to be protecting your rights, not infringing upon them. So hopefully, I think we're starting to see some forward movement, definitely with Indigenous rights, and I'm hopeful with statelessness too. But I think it's important to focus on these because they're they're not as direct as some human rights violations, right? If we're talking about torture, if we're talking about genocide, these are horrific, horrific things, and we should be looking at them. But there are a lot of human rights issues that aren't quite as in your face, right? They're more nuanced, they're more complicated, and we have to look at those because those are often some of the things that differentiate between surviving and really living the good life, right? Certainly I don't want anybody to be tortured, I don't want anybody to be executed, but that's talking about living. What happens when you have people who are alive, right? All their basic survival needs are met. That in itself is not living a life of human dignity. I think most of us would say on our list that we write of the essential prerequisites, food and water is not the end of your list, right? Oxygen, you're going to ask for other things. And so that's really what this is about, pushing it to the next level and saying, well, what else do people need to live a life of dignity?